I want to speak this evening with you about what we've called the evolving cannabis space, from medical research and education to decriminalization and regulation. They're very different things, and obviously only certain aspects of this involve the practice of medicine. So thank you first for letting me speak to you as physician, healers, people interested in the therapeutics, because it extends beyond what allopathic docs in particular, like myself, an MD, are trained. At least osteopaths, I believe, have a better education on how the body integrates with its environment. And here's the tip off. It's all about endocannabinoids and how they work. So while I will spend some time describing the basic science as reminders, or for those people who don't understand it, correlating that with the history. And yes, I don't think we're many people from Reefer Madness era, but we're certainly all practicing, if you're an older senior doc, from even the onset of the Controlled Substances Act, 1970 versus 1937. But we've got about 85, coming on 90 years of federal disposition on this that impacts what physicians are or are not taught. So we have some obligatory commercials here. These are the attestations, and there's one really interesting one down toward the bottom. These are standard for CME approved content. And it says, if I'm discussing any product that is off-label, I will disclose the use or indication in question is not currently approved by the FDA for labeling and advertising. So my answer to that is all Schedule 1, which is what cannabis or marijuana is now, are by definition off-label. So I think just about everything then I say you can take with that grain of salt. However, they're mostly talking about THC. And in this case, I have not received any commercial income. And I hope that gives me the privilege to speak with you about what is coming, which is the DEA's announcement about rescheduling. It's more so the HHS and the White House, which since 2022 has been tasked on looking at this again. And I'm going to show a few slides later on, just quick video clips of a few of our surgeon generals, the nation's top doc, whether MD or DO, and give you a sampling of how they've sort of adjusted and changed from being some for, some against, most of them without any particular slant one way or the other, but only recently looking at the research and now speaking differently because of potential rescheduling. As Bill said, I do know about plants. I hybridize and breed, but what you won't find at my place is anything illicit. But this is me with some of my plants in the greenhouse. So extending the talk to this plant, there's a classical picture. Marijuana or cannabis sativa, anybody who tells you otherwise for species names is simply wrong. This plant has been around with documentation by humans for over 6,000 years, archaeological evidence going for closer to 10 to 12,000 years. And it was found in parts of the world where it originated from, in Asia, off of the eastern slopes of the Himalayas, that 10,000 years ago, there were very few, very special areas called refuge, which would be warm and wet enough, even during the Ice Age, for certain animal and plant species to survive. Cannabis is well evidenced to have come from that side of the world. And so we look at it from different guidelines of how the FDA and the DEA, two federal organizations, regard it. And they're notably different. Safety and efficacy is something that's looked at for the Food and Drug Administration. And while traditionally we think of that as far as pharmaceuticals and drugs, cannabis has tried to also have impact as a nutraceutical, so that the guidelines and standards for the pharmaceuticals, which are lower for nutraceuticals, could work their way into common manufacturing. So this is where the FDA gets sort of stuck in the middle, while the DEA looks at risks and benefits, and then they have authority, actually through appointment through the Department of Justice, to classify things as either prohibited. Schedule 1 means you can't get it. If you do, it's a crime. Versus controlled substances, Schedules 2, 3, 4, and 5, for those of you with the DEA license. And those are things with progressively less generally considered dependence-forming addicting side effects. So that's really the guidelines. But The actual definition then for Schedule 1, which is what we're talking about today, is that a substance has to have a high potential for abuse, no currently accepted use for treatment in the United States, by the way, that's specific there. And then a lack of accepted safety under medical supervision, which is rather challenging to do when the threat of a doc perhaps losing their license from violating the DEA's guidelines here happens. So that's not really much evidence in number 3 there. But certainly the first two have been looked at as differently in the last, for the most part, 7 years. But I'm going to go back a little further, talking about the history for a moment of some other plants. And here you have opium and cocaine, both of which are Schedule 2. And yes, cocaine is actually used as pledgets of the liquid for ear, nose, and throat surgery because cocaine as a local anesthetic is unique in that it's also a vasoconstrictor. Most other local anesthetics don't vasoconstrict. So for nose surgery, it's sort of getting two for the price of one. And do people really get, buzzed on cocaine when given that way? Maybe to a little extent. I've done anesthetics for people, and I could sort of see the way that it balances out perhaps some of the other sedative hypnotics that might be given as a sedative. But even cocaine is Schedule 2. Now, other plants can include tobacco. And there's the one plant that is responsible for more preventable deaths globally by far than any other plant we'll talk about. And then right here in my own backyard, Dr. Clearfield saw these last year. Chocolate and coffee, if you don't think those have dependence-forming features to them because of their chemical content, but the last 3 are all part of our culture. So getting right into things about cannabis, this is from a little over 10 years ago in Florida. It shows a doc with a badge there saying Florida Medical Association, of which I am a proud member. But I wouldn't be proud of what he's saying because at this point, my mom, who is still alive, it looked like her a little bit, who could say, hey, how about, can I get some for pain? And the doc says, I don't know, we get unintended consequences. Instead, he prescribes OxyContin. And that knee-jerk response was something that was sort of driven into doctors for prescribing for pain for many years. And even the federal government from JACO, or the Joint Commission's guidelines, were wanting our patients to come out of there with smiley faces in their evaluations, and pain gives those frowning faces with the little tear. So people actually prescribed and practiced according to those types of systems. But a few years later, it's come out that actually, and this is going to be a repeating theme tonight, science and reason really do matter. So remembering that phrase, the first supporting science about endocannabinoids, how the body actually works, became really powerfully apparent to me in a paper from 2013. And it's a paper from the NIH called Targeting the Endocannabinoid System. And this artwork is not directly from the paper. I'll show you the cover of the paper in just a second. But the message in the federal government's evaluation of cannabis at that point said that it needs focused research. What does that mean? Well, if you're going to think about the endogenous endocannabinoid system as natural, that's fine because it is. It's inside us. We all have it. You need to know how it works, its mechanism of action, and its purpose. But if you're going to think that cannabis, because it's natural, naturally helps us, that's another entirely different subject. So I encourage you to first understand the mechanism for how the body's own cannabinoids, which have been around for 500 million years. Cannabis as a plant has only been around for 90 million years. So it's a blip in time that this plant has found through trillions upon trillions of genetic reiterations, a way to interact with a lipid-based receptor system. I am emphasizing lipids because that's really what's unique compared to other systems. And it has controlling features in it that had the writers, the authors of this paper, make this statement. And remember, this is an NIH statement. And the paper actually is called Modulating the Endocannabinoid System in Human Health and Disease, Successes and Failures. But the authors are Pal Packer and George Kunos. What you can't see from their names written at the top there is that these are two MD, PhD researchers. They don't only know what things happen to a lab rat. They know enough, of course, as physicians to have made the statement that's highlighted below in there in yellow, and I'm going to enlarge it for you to see that when I read modulating endocannabinoid system activity may have therapeutic potential, in almost all diseases affecting humans. Coming out of the NIH, I said, I got to learn more about this, because that was such a profound statement, so far reaching, that I said, maybe not in my lifetime, but there's a whole lot of potential there. And that's because the system is a whole lot complicated, but not impossible to understand purpose, as humans did going back even ancient China here, 700 BC. This is a shaman's tomb, somebody who's supposed to be not just special, holy, understanding, perhaps health or different treatments. Buried with this shaman are female cannabis flowers in those two vessels. The female flowers, when they're not pollinated, have the greatest concentration of those cannabinoids, including THC, that make people feel the way to cannabis is well known to. And here they are separating out cultivation-wise those parts of only female plants because of the knowledge of the time. And in the Middle East, there are still fields of cannabis there, naturalized fields that we called landrace fields, because a landrace field, when grown by humans, represents two things. It represents the plant grown in the constraints of whatever part of the world that field is in, and it represents the needs of what people are growing it. So you'll find in a few places in the world ancient fields, sometimes a few thousand years old. And the key here is that the contents of these plants is not what you'll see grown today. The contents in these plants had approximately the same amount of THC and cannabidiol, CBD, the second principal cannabinoid that's been more widely discovered in the last 15 or so years as a treatment potentially for children with intractable seizures. Well, overall, I'll just say that it's very good in relieving anxiety, while THC is actually anxiety provoking, especially in novice users. So the two sort of balance themselves out. And speaking of balances with plant things that are smoked or consumed, a similar thing happens with how tobacco is inextricably connected with cannabis, because when the tobacco plant, which is from the New World, came back with Columbus on his second voyage, the Caribbeans down here in my part of the country had already been cultivating it and pineapples, and they made their way back to Europe, where people put some of that tobacco in their pipe along with the cannabis leaves and said, wow, that's an interesting combination. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the terms joint, blunt, or spliff, they all represent different combinations, in fact, of marijuana and tobacco. So here's how the plant has changed. Pay attention to this slide, because it'll give you an idea since 1970, since we referenced the Controlled Substances Act starting then, about what happens with the content of THC and CBD at the bottom there. The graph on the left are percentages of what's called dry flower weight. In other words, a single molecule that's found in the cannabis female flowers by dry weight. And here's what happened. Back before 1970, there was a balance between the two that seldom even approached 5%. And back in those days, if something was 4 or 5%, it had dedicated names. And if you're going to go back that far, I could say names like Maui Wowie, Acapulco Gold. There were a few of them, but they were meant to represent maybe the finest, at least as far as what got people the most buzzed back then. But it became illegal traditionally for physicians to have anything to do with it, because this is the year that prohibition defines Schedule I prohibition. So what happened after that is that the traditionally used landrace plant cultivars were changing, because the modern plant is chasing that which is prohibited. And if that doesn't make sense to you, think about alcohol when it went through its federal prohibition back in the 1920s. Nobody's making money, or business isn't doing anything. Nobody's interested in weak alcohol then, like beer or wine. So everybody then, if you're going to run like Al Capone, it's spirits, 40% alcohol, or moonshine, extra concentrates. So today's cannabis is growing in that same direction because of this plant. This is 1973. This is a plant that made it back to, well, originally Amsterdam, and then from there almost immediately to California. It became the darling of breeders. This is Richard Evans Schultes, a rather famous Harvard ethnobotanist. And he's standing in Kandahar. This is Afghanistan, where those wars are, and it's a brutal area. These are 8,000-foot plateaus. So these plants get a lot of ultraviolet. The nights are colder than you think. A normal hemp plant is a 20 to 25-foot plant in one growing season. These plants are short and squatty. They have a lot of THC, not as much balanced CBD at all. So the genetics for this push that THC way up. And it also has another chemical called a terpene, which is called myrcene. Myrcene is, well, terpenes are first, those chemicals that give all plants their smells. We are driven to taste and what we want to have or don't want to have, also through our noses. So if something smells right, you go for it. If it doesn't, you stay away. It's just the power of smells. And the plant uses that to basically entice, I guess, which animals are integrating with it. And in this case, myrcene is a particular smell, but myrcene is different for its actions because different smells affect us different ways. For instance, lavender, which some of you may know from bath soaps, things like that, when exposed and smelled, tends to be relaxing. It gives that type of thought. Other smells can even be sedating, but other smells may give you the impression that something is very clean and fresh, like lemon. You know, lemony fresh. Linolene is the name of the chemical in there, but those citrus things can be why they give you a towel as you're coming back on a flight that's soaked in a little lemon stuff. It's nice and warm. You clean your face, you think you're clean. It could be the dirtiest towel, but the lemon fresh is why detergents and grocery stores are lined with things lemon fresh. So this plant then, otherwise known and evolved to being Afghani Kush #1, was very formative in what happened to the plant because the dominant traits from that plant, including the chemicals of THC and myrcene high, created these short indica hybrids. Why is that important? Because with the concentration of what's going on here, these plants are getting stronger and stronger over the next several decades to be right now approaching 25%, not 5% THC. And for the CBD, actually getting up some now, approaching even 15% CBD. But remember, on top, I said it created short indica hybrids. The simple reason why this plant was so formative with its dominant genetics in virtually every plant you'll find out there today is because it's a short plant. It's easy to hide from a helicopter. And if you don't think that had something to do with California growers for decades, you're wrong. It really does make a difference. So this is why this plant is grown inside. In essence, then, unbalanced modern plants devolve from traditional balances. Life is all about balance. This was a little poster thing we commissioned before about mind-body imbalances. But these are the different leaders of healthcare in different parts of the world historically. And so whether it was in China, Egypt, India subcontinent, or even Greece, which led to Western understanding of health and wellness, it was all over the world, and it still is because humans brought this around the world. The vector for the plant spreading was not simply a pollen that floats or anything like that. It was humans bringing it with us in order to make hemp too. So this is the United States Pharmacopoeia from 1820. Cannabis was mentioned in there and stayed there till 1942. When it, well, pardon me, it started in 1850 in there with its first entry, but by 1942 it was removed, which was the first edition of this after 1937. So from that point on, no information about cannabis is provided by the US government. This is our US government's source for not only pharmaceuticals, but nutraceuticals and everything you ever needed to know about plant-based medicines. So where is it at now in terms of licensing and education? Important question, because we just talked about how if it comes out of prohibition, then it will be entered in the United States Pharmacopoeia's next edition and be available for medical students to learn. This is one of the pitfalls now of prohibition because it's not really significantly in any medical school curricula for MDs, or I've specifically included DOs here. And that's because nothing is asked about cannabis on the national board exams. When physicians finish medical school, MD or DO, you're not able to practice medicine in almost any state until you have that 3 parts of the national board passed. And if it's not asked about, the medical schools are generally not devoting the time needed. There's a lot of other things the students need to know. They're not devoting the time to cannabis. So if it comes out of prohibition, I predict that we'll have about a 10-year hiatus from the first year students coming in to medical school, staying, doing an internship residency before they're actually out practicing medicine in the community. Could be as long as a decade. I know this because I've been involved at our medical school, the University of Miami, where I've been actually honored to give the oath of medicine at commencement as president of our alumni association. So Hippocrates is not simply accredited with having the oath, which we actually don't give that specific oath here, but also with having said that nature itself is the best medicine, which is why I showed Hippocrates as one of the fathers of modern medicine. Modern medicine, though, is dictated by, and generally the agenda of agendas and curricula are based on a relatively strict German-based understanding of how you learn things based purely and only on evidence-based data. We're almost taught to reject other things, and that can stifle innovation or the way people think about how to interpret what might be something important, but yet that didn't meet the most stringent criteria yet. There's been criticism of this approach in US education, but now let's jump to the clinician, because this puts many of us, if we were practicing this medicine in a state where it's legal, it's hard to balance it in a real balanced practice. I wouldn't encourage people to only see patients for cannabis, but to think about incorporating it in as yet one other tool to the practice. What does it do? It actually explains for some people who may not be simply an allopath or a osteopath, but homeopathic docs always are wondering about this elusive brain-gut connection. The microbiome is clearly explained, and I'll show a slide later on of CB2 receptors. The microbiome absolutely is an endocannabinoid-driven process, and this is where that yin-yang balance, which is why that shape is there, centers on chemicals, the middle one of which is THC. The other molecules are investigational things, all of which are known to have interacted with not one, but two types of cannabinoid receptors. CB1 on the left are those that are generally thought of as being in the mind and the nerves and the nervous system, while CB2 is generally in the periphery. Now, CB2 receptors are really activated real time and on demand, but the body's own chemicals that interact with it, that I'll tell you about in just a moment, do so that are site specific and without a much duration of action. They're almost decomposed after they do what they're supposed to do instantaneously. So the difference between that action versus cannabis's chemicals is cannabis's chemicals are not site specific. It covers many areas of the brain and body, and it lasts a considerably longer time than the body's own chemicals. So where are those chemicals? Well, we talked about CB1 receptors and things in the brain, and I want to go right there because those little yellow dots describe where THC is known to interact in the brain. This is an image from the NIH. And what I want you to see is all of those areas that are labeled. It can tell you how many different things cannabis can affect and what the body's own chemicals are doing to keep you so that you can have a certain balance between what you remember and you don't, if I'm going to go from memory, what rewards you and what doesn't in terms of dependency. Certainly your judgment, movement, sensations, even vision and coordination all have impact. What you won't find is you won't find this down where I've put those X's, the brainstem. And that's where the drive for breathing comes from. So unlike the opioids and all the things you hear about fentanyl, which have their action to stop breathing happening in that medulla and pons area of the brainstem, cannabinoids receptors are not found there. So it's virtually impossible to have so much cannabis to where somebody would stop breathing. If you hear that as the argument for why cannabis should be legal, remember, if somebody has enough cannabis, they will pretty much fall asleep. And if they're driving somebody, they can kill themselves or somebody else in that process. So plenty of people have died from having too much cannabis. Having said that, those CB1 receptors notably absent in the brainstem is kind of a neuroanatomical advantage that's distinct from other, not just opioids, but other sedative hypnotics as well. Another diagram for showing the ECS, but from the brain, how it's interacting with the body. These are just some of the peripheral consequences, as you can see on the right, how vital it is, not only to adipose tissue, but muscles, liver, pancreas, the GI tract. And here's what it does. This is the key point I'm going to bring up. The two little receptors I've circled in the top left there, CB1 and CB2. This is an older chart. This is a decade ago of receptors, human receptors that are known. And the actions of those cannabinoids, all of the other receptors' actions are subordinate to the impact of what those cannabinoid receptors are doing. They are fine-tuning every other receptor system in the body, which, by the way, the other ones are all water-based, but this lipid-based system is doing that. And here's the mechanism for how it's actually done. This is a view of a synapse. So the top portion coming down, more of the aqua color, is the presynaptic vesicle. The space or the synapse between that and the purple area, which would be the postsynaptic surface, is where one nerve talks to another. And that's a very important point here, because what's happening at all of these little synapse interspaces is that the action of the CB1 receptor, you see in the middle there, CB1, that is in fact through two chemicals that are going retrograde from the bottom on the postsynaptic to the top. You'll see a turquoise and a sort of pink peach arrow going up saying 2-AG and anandamide. And those are the body's own principal 2 ligands that THC is trying to mimic, especially the 2-AG, because it's what's called a partial agonist. It's not a full on-off, more the way that 2-AG is. But anandamide is the chemical that THC most closely resembles. As a matter of fact, anandamide is a Sanskrit word for bliss or balance. So this was understood 30 years ago, nearly 30 years ago, as being the role of what anandamide does. So what it does then, in terms of a mechanism, follow a little quick animation here. When activated, it sends impulses, and that 2-AG and anandamide, you notice THC off to the right is coming in not as part of the loop, but as an independent molecule. And what it's doing, it is making a little release there of a feedback loop, in this case, glutamate as the neurotransmitter, associated with pain, this one, but it's all neurotransmitters, okay? You're also talking about adrenaline, atropine, all neurotransmitters, even dopamine, have some of their effects, if not controlled, all of their effects really managed through the impact of these cannabinoid receptors. And therefore, those two chemicals naturally, anandamide and 2-AG, are controlling everything else in the body. And if you want to talk about balance, here's really what happens, because receptors have positive things that change their constitutive balance and things that counteract that. So in looking at this diagram here, for the top one showing positive regulation, here you can see the effect of having a full agonist versus a partial agonist. This is how THC works on the top. And yet you can also have negative control on the receptors, and that's what's happening here, where the activity then can be changed by what are called inverse agonists, not partial agonists. And this is the way not only the body works, but this is the way pharmaceutical companies are starting to look at how do we manage some people which may have too high of a tone of this, they call it endocannabinoid tone, or if somebody, and this is a phrase I don't particularly espouse to, endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome. People will use that. I think we're still, perhaps decades away from classifying it as a syndrome. For the most part, if you do healthy things and you have a healthy mind and body and get back to doing some of the things I'm sure that many of our grandmothers emphasized, we probably have healthier endocannabinoid systems. So let's get right into the politics a moment. I'm going to have to do something here just to get my slide back. Okay, here we go. Today, I'm down here at the University of Miami, but most of the research for cannabis in Florida happens at the Agricultural Center for our state, which is at the University of Florida. Um, I am a master gardener by the University of Florida's IFAS program. That's what does it stand for? International Food and Agricultural Sciences. But I'm also the longest standing physician member on the hemp pilot project because Florida had legal hemp before marijuana. And so the research into hemp is also something that I'm interested in because that's where agriculture is based. at Miami doesn't have much agriculture, so I sort of wear two hats. This is really where we're at, though, in January of this year for legalization. I don't know which states all of you are in. I know we probably have a contingency from the West Coast, California, maybe Nevada, and the Northeast. Is now possibly there. But in the Philippines, I want you to know that this is how divided we are, but this is the way our country works. The states are independent experiments in essence. And then when we have enough of a consensus, you would think that that creates the majority in a democracy to change a law. It's politicized, though, as well, because we rely on our government for at least public health concerns. And that's why the states, when you see them in this map looking well balanced, don't necessarily respect the populations in those states. This is a little more of a morphed map that'll tell you how many people in which parts of the country seemingly are getting it and have it available versus ones that don't. And then globally, this is a few years old, and I guess you might be able to find out where in Asia you can see that it's legal, totally illegal, or whichever. I know that Thailand, where I visited in March, it is legal there, and there's people with concerns there. But most of the rest of the world outside of some parts of the United States where it's legal, Canada and other places in Europe, Thailand, and most other places are still not really deciding how it's going to be yet. I think that they are waiting for the United States to impact the United Nations Convention on Drugs, as well as the World Health Organizations. So I want to try to get between politics, law, and basic sciences to really give you a feel in the next few slides on where this comes from. One of my, idols here emphasizes that I have to keep some of this simple. And if this isn't a simple enough understanding for ancient cultures, how they taught their their next generations about health and wellness, maybe he could be your grandpa or your grandma. I was talking about maybe your actual grandmother teaching you healthy things, but botanical wisdom was key to health and wellness. That's where most of the chemicals came from. Jump forward thousands of years, and you have modern science. And that's why I'm showing this PET scan. This is a PET scan from 2013, and it actually shows where CB2 receptors are. Remember, I said there's the CB1 receptors, brain mostly thinking about those functions, while the body is, for the most part, CB2. CB2 receptors generally lie dormant, and they respond when there's a disease or an injury specifically in that area to keep that area in balance with what nature requires. And in a very real sense, if you think about balances and what nature requires, if an organism becomes out of balance with nature, it becomes extinct. And that's a very important point to realize that cannabinoids then in all animals, not simply mammals, not simply higher primates, all vertebrates and invertebrates have endocannabinoids that keep those animals in balance. So here's the interesting part about this picture. If you look closely at the it would be the lower left of the screen, you'll see a little spot by the hand. That's an intravenous site. And this is a picture PET scan taken 2 hours after the injection of a radioisotope labeled chemical molecule that binds the CB2 receptors. So this then maps out not so much the orange areas, but the yellow and greens. The orange also impacts from blood flow. But all of that green area focused generally in the abdominal area is where CB2 receptors are. Why do I want you to see that? Because now you have a picture of an acupuncture chart. This particular one dates back, you know, 1500 years ago, but this is the way acupuncture as an Eastern culture's understanding to health and wellness. If you look closely, or if any of you are familiar with acupuncture, you'll understand not just the concept, but what qi really means. Qi, I have to get back to a slide apparently again. Qi, if you look on the right, is the word that in Eastern cultures generally is conferring life through flow. And in our culture, health, we involve life with immunity. Well, those of you who know anything about acupuncture is life's forces, the vitality does not flow through the brain or the heart or the lungs. It goes through the gut. And even ancients understood that the flow of life, I mentioned the gut microbiome before, this is where the body interfaces with its environment more than your skin outside. This is what determines which bacteria are good for you, what can kill you when you eat it versus what will make you healthier. The Eastern cultures understood a concept of qi while we understand in Western medicine immune systems. If you don't have an intact immune system or an intact endocannabinoid system, you'll be dead in a few days. And so the understanding now is where Western medicine's new science future actually is meeting Eastern medicine's traditional past. And that really is how I interpret what integrative medicine is, the namesake now of your organization trying to get some of these critical concepts of a global understanding of health and wellness into your own organizations. So I want to go to where my background is a moment to tell you how many, if not most people, are using cannabis today, as well as how preparations of plants have impacted people when we want to know about pain. So I'm going to devote the next few moments about telling you how pharmaceuticals have evolved over the last 200 years for the treatment of pain. And endorphins, endocannabinoids, and endovaniloids, if you notice, these are all 20th century discoveries. How these particular ligands for three independent systems impacting pain were found. Endorphins goes way back to 1974, and of course, that's the opium poppy for morphine. While endocannabinoids discovery didn't happen until the early 1990s, and that's describing how cannabis's THC and CBD and other cannabinoids work. While endovaniloids, that's the chili pepper. Trying to get the next, there we go. And capsaicin. And those of you familiar with one approach to pain or the other would understand that too much of any one of these may hijack the perception of pain and want people to have more of it or even develop dependencies. That's the ugly side. However, the right dose is the lowest effective dose of any of these. And here's what pharmaceutical companies knew over 100 years ago. Chlorodyne is a good example of a popular pain medicine. All pharmaceutical companies had it. This one is Park Davis's version in the early 1900s. But in the early 20th century, botanical formularies were widely used. These were pills, but they had in it extracts from morphine, cannabis, and capsaicin, all three, but in small amounts that mitigated the side effects of any one chemical. Jump forward to basically the end of the 20th century, and the research then identified only then endorphins, endocannabinoids, endovaniloids. It's about receptors. And anesthesiologists are supposed to be receptor-specific pharmacists and experts in physiology. This is the reason I understood this not very clearly, but with an appreciation for how plants interface with our receptors years ago. And in essence, physicians years ago also would have known that even though chlorodyne in this case was well documented as effective for pain, it was also abused. There were plenty of times where people took a whole bottle of it or several bottles as a way to take the pain away and actually resulting in death. So the question becomes more of an ethical one. And we're going to digress here just a moment to say we're all trying to do the right thing. And the challenge of should we provide compassionate access to cannabis while it remains under federal prohibition, there are medical legal ethics that are between the American Medical Association and physicians trying to do the right thing. And in this case, the AMA says that a physician shall respect the law and also recognize a responsibility to seek changes in those requirements that are contrary to the best interests of the patient. Why is that very hard to do? It's because many physicians in the country, if not most, have two licenses. And yes, one of them is to practice medicine legally in their state. But when a state has not a clear understanding, or if state even does, and you have a federal DEA license that says you can't do it, that conflict puts many physicians in a position where they don't want to have to deal with the principles of medical ethics here. So I was told about this about 10 years ago because the University of Miami as a medical school has, believe it or not, the longest standing continuous ethics department of a medical school in the United States. It's over 60 years old. And I had some deep thought and deep talks with the chair of that department about bioethics. And that's what I want to show you a moment is the way I've dealt with being into this subject to where I can understand what it is. And although I don't see patients myself to authorize cannabis, I got kids. They're just 19 years old now. And I wanted them to think 10 years ago, if dad's going to talk about marijuana, he's going to do it from at least a bioethical basis or platform. So we devised this sentence that seeking relief from the intolerable symptoms, physical, psychological, or spiritual, of injuries or diseases, it's instinctive. And it contributes to medicinal substances use and abuse. I'm not putting a value judgment on that. I'm just connecting the two, that animals will self-soothe, and it's just a natural response. So what's different about that is that there's actually another statement that I don't see in my slide here coming up. I apologize, but the next statement would be from the physician's perspective to do something bioethical, which would be that society has healers as the designated representatives to help alleviate pain and suffering. So those two statements are irrefutable, and it's what gives at least me the thought that I do have a bioethical basis for offering it to some patients, but not all, because here's the data you really need to pay attention to. This is public health data. And yes, it goes back 20 years, but I want to show you a trend. This appeared in JAMA in 2004. I want to show you a trend of the leading causes of public death, preventable death. And I said tobacco smoking was by far the leading cause of it. That's going down over the next several years, and that's a public health victory. But what's not is lethal opioid overdoses during the same time frame. Because what happened, it went, drug abuses, deaths went from the ninth most frequent trend over the last 15 years. And this was, by the way, from a few years ago when I did this slide. By 2019, it surpassed motor vehicle accidents. I'd be curious to see, because this predates fentanyl, but it's not as recent as infectious diseases, which could include COVID. So this is a very dynamic chart, but let's say that drug abuse is on the way up, tobacco smoking's on the way down, and where drug abuse may have a legal entry from industry, this is the industry that's driving some of the things that we're talking about today. And the analysis of how it impacts public health, well, the jury's still out, but obviously it has a seedy side to it. And if you're going to follow things, even in terms of income and what's going on in the market, just in the recent month or two, since the announcement that the DEA plans to reschedule, some of these cannabis stocks are dumping right now because they're figuring, oh, well, if that's the case, everything's going to be fine for everybody and we're not going to be able to make a killing in it or whatever. But I'm bringing up that it's a very dynamic time politically and for industry, and docs are stuck in the middle Here's another cartoon I'm going to show you for a second because the cart can get ahead of the horse, so to speak. And in this case, if an unwitting doc is the one who is basically allowing things to happen because of anecdotal reports, that's not evidence-based data, or stakeholder bias, then the horse that should lead it with evidence-based data and bioethical reason is being dragged along. And this cartoon sort of brings that to light. But it's not just me. Look, you have leading docs. The nation's top doc is generally considered to be the Surgeon General of the United States. And if you look back to 1970 in the top left, Dr. Jesse Steinfeld, he came out for cannabis, even though that was the same time he was the Surgeon General when the Controlled Substance Act there. Then his successor said, nah, I don't know either way. And then bottom left, C. Edward Koop. That's who was Surgeon General when I'm graduating medical school. He did great things for smoking and tobacco. He's very strong-handed, but did what he wanted. He said he was against it. So even there, the next three Surgeon Generals, all political appointees, were for it, not either way, and then against it. You go through the next several, and you can only see that in the recent years, have you now seen not clearly pro or con since 2002 on the right side there. The interesting thing about that is it's the political discord, because in that political discord, you'll see conversations evolving on a federal level that get into the politics. And this statement about the politics happening and getting in the way of realizing that science and reason matter is a kind of a profound statement there. And I wanted to make note of it again, because I told you I was going to drive in that science and reason matter above the politics. So what do we have about Surgeon Generals?
Surgeon General, while we have you here, I want to get you on the record about whether you support the legalization of marijuana and what concerns do you have?
Well, marijuana is an interesting story that's unfolding in our country right now. And we have, had a long history of discussion around the benefits and risks of marijuana. We have experiments that are going on in many states right now where medical marijuana has been legalized, and in at least a few states where it has been legalized even for recreational use.
We want to know your position.
Note the year, 2015.
Yes, well, my position is that we have to see what the science tells us about the efficacy of marijuana. And I think we're going to get a lot more data on that. We have some preliminary data showing that for certain medical conditions and symptoms, that marijuana can be helpful. So I think that we have to use that data to drive policymaking. And I'm very interested to see where that data takes us.
Dr. Vivek Murthy, we thank you for doing your first live interview with us here on CBS. Good to see you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great to be with you.
I'll tell you what, he looks like a kid there, doesn't he? He looks like in his Surgeon General's uniform that, it's oversized. But he actually, believe it or not, was a valedictorian from my high school here in Miami. And he's also the first two-time Surgeon General. I'm going to show you in just a moment the Surgeon General that followed him, who happens to be an anesthesiologist. And the disposition that I wanted to point out in this last comment that he gave, Dr. Murthy, was from 2015. Why is that important? Well, there was a government commissioned study through the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. It was meant to follow up with and be the next edition of Marijuana and Medicine, which was the predecessor institute for there, called the Institute of Medicine, from in the 1990s. But now in 2017, in January, the report on the right came out. And a federally commissioned study, it was a meta-analysis, and they divided different things that had evidence-based data into statements saying that there was either no evidence-based data, and that covered many, many things, where there may have been limited, moderate, substantial evidence-based data, or only in one situation, conclusive medical evidence-based data that cannabis worked for certain diseases. So this is generally the publication. You can pull it up anytime you'd like. But what it found was this. THC has its best efficacy for chemotherapy, nausea, and vomiting. That's the one that has conclusive medical evidence. While chronic pain and multiple sclerosis muscle spasm treatments with cannabinoids has substantial evidence-based data. Why am I singling out just those three? Well, because they're of the highest evidence-based data that was looked at in that meta-analysis. Again, federal government sponsored, in essence, commissioned. And yet it talks about CBD, what it might be helpful for, but what it says on the bottom, little benefit, glaucoma, ALS, and Parkinson's right now. So that's where it is now. But I want to show you a moment what the following Surgeon General says. Jerome Adams, again, an anesthesiologist, was President Trump's Surgeon General. And he's having to deal with the reality I showed you on previous slides of just how concentrated cannabis is now, entirely unnatural. And some of his comments bring that up. So here's a little interview of him in 2019.
I'm very, very concerned as Surgeon General at how far and how fast we're going on marijuana in this country. Very concerned. Number one, this isn't your mother's marijuana. Marijuana a decade ago was 5% THC, single digits THC. You now have professionally grown.
Excuse me.
I'm very, very concerned as Surgeon General at how far and how fast we're going on marijuana in this country. Very concerned. Number one, this isn't your mother's marijuana. Marijuana a decade ago was 5% THC, single digits THC. You now have professionally grown strains that are 20, 30% THC, and then they're concentrating them into oils, into waxes. They're vaping in, they're dabbing them, they're shatter, and you're getting 90, 95% THC. It's like the difference between you having a glass of wine and a pint of grain alcohol. It literally is. And so we've normalized this idea of marijuana use across the country way too fast, to the point that in communities in California, there's 1 in 5 pregnant women, 20% of pregnant women reporting that they are using marijuana during pregnancy. Youth attitudes are changing about marijuana across the country. And I want you to hear me say this as the nation's doctor. There is no such thing as medical marijuana. And I see some eyebrows raised out there. We don't talk about medical foxglove. We don't talk about medical opium. There is no other substance out there that, as a physician, we say grow it in your backyard, crumble it up, bake it into a brownie, or roll it into a cigarette and smoke it, and that's going to be good for whatever ails you. There are over 100 components of marijuana, some of them which have medicinal properties and medicinal promise, and we need to make sure we push for the research so that we can say to each individual, this component has been proven to be beneficial for your disease, and here are the risks and the benefits.
Okay, so Dr. Adams then is pointing out that the concentrates may be entirely unnatural, and that sometimes it's, well, I'll tell you what, he's an anesthesiologist, I mentioned, and I mentioned that anesthesiologists are clinical pharmacists. I'm going to give you some pharmacy wisdom from centuries ago. And these statements of that sometimes it's the dose that defines a poison is true. We can have too much oxygen or water and hurt ourselves, and sometimes kill yourselves too much water. So just because something is natural and good doesn't mean that at any concentration or dose that it's going to have the same effects that humans had probably evolved with for those close to 10,000 years, which has been significantly changed in the last 50. So what does that mean? It means that medical research in the USA, as a result of that study, that 2017 National Academies report, these are the recommendations to develop a comprehensive evidence base, which would be a lot easier to do if it's not prohibited. Research becomes facilitated. Development of a conclusive evidence of other things. Ensure that sufficient data is available, and create a committee of experts tasked with the objective of evidence-based reporting. It's kind of basic stuff, but it hasn't been able to happen under the constraints of federal prohibition. So I'm going to show you one last Surgeon General comment. It happens to be the current Surgeon General, who is again Dr. Murthy from 2 terms ago. But now things are different, because now we're talking in the 2021, which was after the National Academies report. And at this point that he's giving the talks, just before the Biden administration tasked their HHS to relook at cannabis in 2022. They did so. HHS sent their recommendation that it should be changed to Schedule 3 as a controlled substance, and that was turned over to the DEA a few months ago. I think it was in May, and in the beginning of December, is when the DEA then will have their public testimony and development potentially of rules. It may not happen then, and it may be politicized yet again, depending on who next is in the White House if changes are there. The interesting thing is this is the Biden administration's push on it, and former President Trump, at least for being a Florida citizen, last week came out for the Florida adult use or recreational measure. That's a constitutional amendment proposed for November, and he came out in favor of that, which is in contrast to our governor and Republican Party here in Florida. So politics makes for interesting bedfellows. And yet, in this case, what I'd be saying is that either of the two parties vying for the next White House spot seemingly are interested in having it at least in Florida. So to move on then, this is Dr. Murthy. Mind you, he's 8 years older. He doesn't look so young anymore.
Okay. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer introduced legislation this week to decriminalize marijuana at the federal level. From a health perspective, do you support that?
Well, when it comes to marijuana, Dan, I think we have to let science guide us. And we know that the science tells us that there are some benefits for marijuana from a medical perspective, but there are also some harms that we have to consider, and we have to put those together as we think about the right policy. Now, when it comes to decriminalization, I don't think that there is value to individuals or to society to lock people up for marijuana use. I don't think that serves anybody well. But I do think that in terms of our approach to marijuana, I worry when we don't let science guide our process and policy making. And in a certain general, that's my role, is to work with policymakers, to work with members in the community and the general public to help people understand what science tells us and where you have gaps to help fill those gaps with research and with honest inquiry.
Dr. Vivek Murthy, thank you so much for joining me this morning. Appreciate it.
So I'm going to want to wrap up. We're approaching the top of the hour. And I'll just say that if I can understand this, everybody on this call can. I hope I did a decent job in explaining to you some of the mechanisms, the politics, the evolution of this, even the plant's evolution itself. So I will say that since COVID, I've been fairly busy. I've written 4 chapters in these 3 textbooks. These are real medical published textbooks. You'll be hard pressed to find much otherwise. Of note, the first one is on pain, and that's the integrative management of pain if anybody's interested. The second book that came out last summer on cannabis chemistry and biology, and I'm not selling the books, I don't make a royalty on it, by the way. But that second book's editor and the picture on that second book is actually of the farms at the University of Mississippi. The University of Mississippi, since the Controlled Substance Act, has had the pretty much exclusive rights to supply the federal government with all research cannabis. Now, it may not be exactly what people are smoking today, but Dr. El Sole there, Mahmoud El Sole, has run that farm for the last 40 years. He's a pharmacist, PhD pharmacist and botanist. We are collegial botanists, having respect for each other. He asked me to write the opening chapter for that book. And that chapter's title is Cannabis, the History of Cannabis, a Story of Coevolution and Human Discovery. So that's the cannabis chemistry background. My background, to at least have some feel for the chemistry, is before medical school at I was at Emory and a chemistry major in the early 70s. The last book just came out. Actually, it was only released a few months ago. It's the 7th edition, Brody's Human Pharmacology. There's actually 2 chapters in that book that I did. One is they asked me to rewrite a previous chapter on cannabinoids. I did. But when I looked at the book, there's another chapter that speaks a lot about cannabis and marijuana called Drugs of Illicit Use and Abuse, which is now their chapter called Substance Abuse Disorders. And it's mentioned in there. I'm the author of that chapter also, and seemingly that's a hot button subject for those of you with DEA licenses where you need to complete a certain minimum amount before your next relicense. So on that basis, then, one last little take-home message. You can see the joint there and the seductive smoke. I don't know what that figure is, a woman or something there, but the take-home message really is that it's temptation. And what do I mean? A temptation's indulgence. It offers us choices. And when you have choices, just like the genie in the bottle who gives you those first few choices, and then there's the gotcha one, the choices offer you choices, but in this case, it cautions us to be careful with what we wish for and with the same final message, because science and reason matter. So on that basis, if anybody would like to contact me further about this, these are 2 emails where I can be reached